Right. Hello, everybody. It's been a while since I've done one of these remote shows where I get a bunch of people together. But John and I had a conversation recently, and afterward, when we stopped recording, we had an interesting chat about scaling Bitcoin. So we talked about getting a few people together to talk about this because it's been a hot subject recently. So yeah, welcome, Giacomo. I'll start with you. Haven't seen you for a while. Good to see you. How are
Good
you?
to see you too. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine. Thank you. I was better in El Salvador, but even here in Europe, it's still fine.
It's good. Okay, Matt, yourself. I've seen you more recently.
Yeah, doing good. Busy as always, but yeah, doing great.
All right. And John, we spoke recently, but I'm glad we're following this up. How are you doing, man?
Oh, pretty good. I just finally got healed from my 2-week flu. I got this bad type A flu thing or whatever that's going around when I visited the US, but that kicked my ass, but I'm back.
Good, good. Well, listen, we're here to talk about scaling Bitcoin. Lots of things have been coming up recently. Bitcoin itself is popping right now with its newest scaling solution, ETFs. I'm sure that'll come up. So I want to start with a question I've been asking on the podcast for a while, and I've still not got a solid answer. And I will direct questions to people. I'm going to start this one with you, Giacomo. I've been asking a lot of people recently, can you be self-sovereign with Bitcoin if you do not control a UTXO?
Well, the answer is yes, but not in a simple way. Self-sovereign means that basically you can take decision about your spending without other people being able to stop you from spending, or take the decision to not to spend without other people forcing you to spend. This is possible with a complex mechanism like Lightning channel, but the more this mechanism of UTXO sharing can allow more people to enter at a better conditions, the harder it is for you to keep this mechanism working without messing up. So yes, you can. For example, I have many Lightning channels where I do not own my own UTXO. I have to share it with another person, and these Lightning channels are self-sovereign. They cannot basically prevent me from spending my part of the channel. This can be scaled up to more users, probably not to everybody, and that's another discussion which is more aggressive.
And with that, Giacomo, is this something that you would have to be quite skilled in Bitcoin to understand and use and set up?
Not really. For example, if I don't want to be a routing node, I can just install Phoenix, and I can just open a channel with Phoenix. I will spend money to have that, of course, but I will receive, or like we have John here, I install BitKit. It's super easy. Non-technical people can do it, and they can receive a Lightning channel. They can be self-sovereign to the degree that they trust the software or can verify the software, to the degree the software is open source and not backdoored. They are self-sovereign, and they don't know anything about Lightning as a protocol. Of course, when you get to some specific conditions and edge cases, you start to feel that you are non-technical. For example, if you don't have incoming liquidity and you need it, if you don't, if routing doesn't exist to the endpoint you want to pay, if you want good privacy and your LSP is tracking your IP, every time you go to edge cases, you may feel that you are not technical because you cannot understand why the LSP is charging you something or not. But to a good degree, a Phoenix user right now can use the Lightning Network without any technical effort. Of course, they have to pay money to do that because, for example, onboarding will require renting some liquidity or opening channels on chain. So it's not free, but it's simple enough.
Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's basically true. I think Lightning is obviously the simplest example here. There are a lot more forward-looking examples where we're going to talk about many-party UTXO ownership, where it's not just one. And then it really does, it becomes a gray area, right? Where in Lightning, you can make a more clear argument that you have the money. Certainly, if you're on-chain, if you fully own the UTXO, there's no risk. Lightning has a slightly different security model. You have to be online to make sure your counterparty doesn't cheat in some way. When we start talking about much different UTXO ownership models, we might start talking about like unilateral withdraw in these cases where like, yeah, okay, there's many people in this UTXO and we're updating it, but maybe you can't afford to pay the fee to withdraw your part of the balance. But in theory, you have ownership of this UTXO. So it very quickly becomes a gray area. But I think it's hard to argue that you're not self-sovereign if you have a small part of a large UTXO and you can unilaterally withdraw it as long as you're willing to pay the fee. Like that's as good as any other form of self-sovereignty when it comes to Bitcoin.
So are you saying if somebody was part of that kind of UTXO, they could build up their stack within that, eventually get to a point where they could afford to exit?
Yeah, potentially. And I mean, you see this now, Mutiny and some others are starting to go this direction where you have potentially Fedimint or something that's clearly not self-sovereign for low-value balances, and then the wallet may be able to upgrade you to Lightning if you have a larger balance, and then maybe you'll store something in fully owned UTXOs if you have an even larger balance and you want kind of a savings account. And so we're going to see these gray areas start to get built up more and more based on your balance level, because for very small balances, there's just nothing you can really do on chain. But then as you build that up, potentially you can withdraw and you can get to the point where it becomes self-sovereign because you can afford the fee. Hopefully in the future, we'll have better technologies than things like Fedimint, so they're less clearly custodial, like Fedimint's clearly custodial. But we can build up to things like payment pools where it's not as custodial. It's really just, I mean, you could take your money, but you have 5 Satoshis and the fee is going to be, $100. But as you get more and more money, potentially nothing changes. You just suddenly could afford the fee.
And John, do you want to throw anything into this?
Yeah, I think I want to bring up a few things. One, that you have to appreciate the amount of complexity that we're assuming when we start having this kind of degrading system for going from custodial to self-custodial, going from, on-chain to Lightning to multi-party to Fedimint to like all these grades, and trying to integrate them into a user experience is possible. And that's the problem, really, is that everybody just says, well, it should be possible, but they don't actually care too much about what the result looks like when you make it possible. And this is a big concern for me, as I'm not an engineer myself. I'm more focused on the product, and we're trying to make products that are easy to use. I'm also trying to make sure that I'm not like LARPing, that I'm just pretending that this is like, oh, we're going through all of these Lightning motions and all of these things, but really the user isn't really enforcing their channels. And so like if we really were a bad actor, we could censor them, we could steal their money, etc., because there isn't for example, other complexity that is healthy, which is a watchtower environment where people can get a watchtower easily within their app from someone else other than us, because that's what it would take. All this stuff is possible, but the complexity required, it makes everything very delicate, and actually ends up resulting in a pretty horrible user experience in the interim. And if we make the interim perpetual, then the user experience will always suck and nobody will ever use it. So we have to be careful about piling on, is how I see it. And so I have no intention of like delivering a user experience that does something like combine Lightning and Fedimint, or combine Lightning and CTV for Lightning covenants, or combine Lightning with even multi-party UTXOs. I am more skeptical. So I use that rant as a segue to another topic, which is I'm not totally sold on UTXO sharing for multi-party. In other words, the nuance of it being 2 people in the party is what allows it to truly be self-sovereign and practical and not overly complex. Arguably, it really is overly complex at this point, but we're going with it anyway. But to now pile on and have like, a whole game within a UTXO, this worries me a lot more. Supposedly, I'm not expert enough to know whether there's nuance here. Multiple UTXO ownership and being able to unilaterally exit, with the only problem being whether you can afford to do so, is possible. It doesn't actually exist. We don't have covenants on Bitcoin. There are other trade-offs to talk about with covenants on Bitcoin. So all of this said, we don't actually know the amount of scale this would even tap into, and what it would really unlock for Bitcoin in a scaling solution. And it could just turn into like with Lightning, 10 years of just trying to get there. You know what I mean? And I think we'll get there, but how long will it take? What will it look like when we're done? I'm not entirely sure. And then finally, I think my other thing was, I already hinted at it with, there's a centralizing aspect to Lightning where it's not just about the LSPs and the hub and spoke. That I think is acceptable, but like I joked, seizing that, like, if our users, other self-custodial Lightning node mobile users don't actually like open their app and enforce their channels, it's a little bit of a LARP to, like, because there's just mobile problems where mobile operating systems don't allow you to operate, like, be on all the time, be available all the time, these kinds of things. So without this watchtower ecosystem, etc., and there are other trade-offs like this, you are kind of just faking it till you get there. And replicating something, like, everybody likes to point at two things currently: Breeze SDK, which is using Greenlight in the background. I don't know how much detail you want to go into what those are, but also there's that, and then what's the other thing that they're harping on? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But with Greenlight SDK, we don't really know if that's going to work out to be that much better. So yeah. And that Phoenix just works, right? But the thing with Phoenix is, this is a whole company that is dedicated and focused on providing Lightning, and they use only their stack. And so they limit their problems to basically whether there's some incompatibility with other implementations. And that allows them to achieve a pretty good user experience. But for other people to replicate that, for everybody to just do what Phoenix is doing, is also a sensorizing factor. So making Lightning interoperable despite using multiple implementations is much easier said than done. So sorry for the rant, but there's those nuances there to bring up.
Before there's, like, I've got 4 notes on that, which we should explore them all. But before I do that, John, is there any other solutions that you think can work, should be worked on, should be considered?
So yeah, this is a bit biased to my own philosophies on Bitcoin and on the future, but I would say, one, on the trusted side, if we're going to do custodial, I would like to see more interest in being able to do some sort of centrally issued bearer instrument that doesn't use a blockchain. I don't think it's actually necessary to have tokens on a blockchain. And more particularly, I think tokens are the simplest expression of trust. And so I'm much more interested in this than things like stable channels and, complexity. I think that just having a central issuer putting their name behind something is as simple as you can get, and being able to pass that thing without necessarily always needing permission from the issuer is the tricky part. And I think that more research should be done. We have people in our family of companies doing research on that in regards to using, DHTs and append logs for this. But I think it could be done, and I think it should be done. And I think what's more interesting is issuing this credit denominated in the product and services, so as to really make it clear that, like, this is about, something that any business would do. The government shouldn't be able to regulate and stop businesses from issuing, digital representations of their products and services. And I think that's like the long-term hack to get this all acceptable and flowing and appropriate. As far as actual technical things like ARC or covenants or these kinds of Arc of the Covenant, sorry. As far as all these things, I don't really believe in any of them, to be honest. I think they're all just curiosities and things that keep engineers busy and keep them interested. Then they could be harmless, they could be helpful, but most of it is just kind of spinning our wheels and experimentation. So I think in the end that we should focus on optimization. It's good to figure out how much use we can make of the block space we have, but that we also need more research into being ready for when Bitcoiners are ready to increase the block size.
So that last thing you said, it sounds a little bit like almost like a Bitcoin bank. Like if some kind of institution or company was holding the Bitcoin, they could then issue tokens backed by Bitcoin. Is that what you're saying? A bit like
that's not what I'm saying. I do think that Tether should also have a Tether Bitcoin. Why not? I just think it's the simplest way to express trust. If you're going to trust somebody to hold your assets for you, I think that what Tether has done has already proven to be, to work pretty well.
Okay. Well, let's start with complexity. I'll start with you on that one, Matt. You are an engineer. you do work a lot on this stuff. One of the things I worry about when people start explaining things such as channels and balancing and liquidity, I tend to stay in the camp of where my friendship circles are and the people I know are, and I'll already have lost them on that. I can win them when I show them a custodial wallet. I can say, here, look, there's your Bitcoin. And I can get them to download wallet to Satoshi and send it to me and back and forth and not have to think about anything. That can work. Once they have to start thinking about opening their own channels, there is a leap of faith required there. There is an educational piece. So the complexity piece worries me. I don't know if that's something you share the concerns of, or maybe John?
Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, Lightning is super complicated. And getting... Obviously, to your point, no one is going to or really ever should use a Lightning wallet that exposes users to the concept of channels or different types of balances and all this kind of nuance that the engineers have to worry about. Lightning wallets only make sense if you can hide that, right? And I think Giacomo mentioned previously, or maybe John mentioned that, you start hiding that too much and suddenly, oops, you're paying this huge fee. Where did this fee come from, and why did this other transaction not have a fee? These are challenging problems to address at a user experience level. I think they're very doable, but there is a limit to it, and certainly Lightning is kind of at that limit in terms of complexity. There's Lightning, I would say Lightning beta has shipped. The Lightning that exists today is really beta, and we're really working on this Lightning. Call it Lightning 1.0 or Lightning 2.0, whatever you want to call it, where there's a number of new features that enable us to much better hide the complexity. So we eat a little more complexity. We add things like splicing. We add things like anchor outputs. We add things like potentially Taproot. We add all these other pieces, Bolt 12, all these other things, and we improve privacy. We improve the ability to hide all of this technical nuance because we can simplify what the interface looks like. And this is really bringing Lightning into, building a Lightning that we're actually proud of and proud to use and proud to have people use. But Lightning is kind of at that limit. And I don't think there's a lot more, people talk about Lightning channel factories where you have more than two people in your Lightning channel, or you have, some of these other design ideas. I've seen people trying to argue that we need to activate CTV or some other Covenant soft fork now so that we can do channel factories and other similar things. No. No, I don't know that we're ever going to want to build those things just because of the amount of complexity we bury ourselves under. But certainly if we do, it won't be for 10 years. So there's a limit.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to say it's really difficult to get people that aren't building Lightning things to appreciate that. Like you try to talk, like for example, Shinobi at Bitcoin Magazine, he's really been impressed with CTV and trying to get people to like come around and be more interested in it. But you try to say something like that to him and he's like, no, you just do this, you just do that. It's really, really hard for people to know how hard it is to implement and run Lightning products. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there have been a lot of really smart people working on Lightning for a very long time, and we're only just now getting to the point where we can say like, oh, this is Lightning the way it should be, with all these other new changes that have started shipping and will ship over the next year. And we've been working on Lightning for how many years now? So it really is, there's a limit. I think it's worth pointing out, however, that as we take more steps into this gray area away from fully self-custodial or fully self-sovereign, things can get a lot simpler. So when we talk about some other designs around multi-party UTXO ownership, around payment pools, around some of these other things, they're certainly further from kind of fully self-sovereign, you always have your funds, whatever, but they also can get a little simpler. And certainly when we start getting all the way over to the far side of that spectrum, when we start talking about things like, Fediment or custodial services, Liquid, whatever it is, things get really simple, really fast. So I don't think the fact that Lightning is so complex is an indication that we can't have other things in this gray area and we can't have more of a middle ground. But if Lightning is any indication, these other things are going to take a very long time to build unless we want to build things that are just fully on the other side, fully custodial, fully trusted.
Giacomo, I'll bring you in there to add any comment you want, and also just ask: are you still very pro Lightning, or with time and understanding, is it potentially a solution that we're still trying to make work, but perhaps was the wrong way to scale Bitcoin?
No, I'm more and more pro Lightning from 2 points. The philosophical point is still the same, basically. Blockchains cannot scale. The idea that every single user will download and validate and store every change of state by any other user forever is an idea that is intrinsically, from a mathematical complexity point of view, unscalable. Sure, you can try to scale it a little bit better with better hardware, but then with better hardware will come more economic growth and more usage and more requests for usage. So it's unscalable. Maybe there is this idea that Satoshi believed in, this idea of using some kind of fraud-proof protocol in order to only store the hash header. So maybe something like that with zero knowledge magic, but I think it's not possible. So the philosophical idea is your alternative is between sharing the on-chain UTXOs in some sovereign way. So it's basically Lightning. And then the alternative is half-fine idea of Bitcoin banks. So you have these two. I think we don't have to demonize the idea of Bitcoin banks. Bitcoin banks don't have to be ETFs of Wall Street. They could be darknet markets. When you go on a darknet markets, you do use a Bitcoin banks. They will just provide you with an address and you do internal transfers. So it's possible to have no KYC, fully pirate by Bitcoin banks, even if trust is difficult to build with the permissionless anonymous stuff, but it's possible. So you have that idea, and then you have Lightning. Lightning is basically a collection of two ideas. One idea is you can share your UTXO among more people. Like Lisa was saying just, I think, a couple of days ago on Nostr, she was saying Lightning is already, a channel is already UTXO sharing. It's already that. The point is that it's just among two people, and we can make it among several people. The second concept of Lightning is routing. So since UTXO sharing will never reach the kind of network effect that you need, because you cannot share UTXO with every people you will interact with, then use the routing effect in order to reach other people outside of your sharing. Lightning is the union of these two ideas, UTXO sharing and basically trustless atomic routing. And this is basically, even if you change the channel from the current Driapun channel to a future L2 channel, and you change your routing without HTLC to pitch, everything you do is still basically Lightning as a design. And from the practical and not philosophical point of view, I just spent 2 months literally paying everything with Lightning Network all day long with my family as well. And it was not always like this. Lightning payments was failing all the time. Now it does just work. I did pay with trusted custodial Chivo wallet receivers or wallet of Satoshi. I did use fully sovereign stuff like Breeze and Phoenix. It does work. I have a few routing nodes. Okay, they don't route very well. The failure rate on the routing nodes is incredible. But as a payer, Lightning experience is starting to become very, very easy. One could say that the high fee environment was a challenge to Lightning. That's true, but it's only half of the story. Getting into Lightning, if you are outside, so putting money inside the network, it's pretty painful when fees are very high, and that's true. But once you are in, high fees, if it's possible, are even making Lightning better to an extent, because more people are forced to use it. And unlike the blockchain, which has a scaling crisis where more people are using it, Lightning Network in some ways gets better as more and more people are using it, because you just find more routes with better liquidity. So from a philosophical point of view, there is no way around Lightning Network. You will have UTXO sharing and you will be happy, and you will have routing and you will be happy. The other, and on top of that, you can have custody. That's the only other way to go. Everything else Matt described is like payment pools. It's just a replacement for the simple concept of a two-party channel. You can replace that. Instead of the typical Driapun channel on Bitcoin, you can have a Driapun channel on Liquid, but it's still a channel. You can have a Fedimint, which is still a channel, but in this case there is more trust involved. You can have a Cashew. Matt mentioned Mutiny, which will make you use Fedimint for small amounts, but you have Aqua letting you use Liquid for small amounts, or for all amounts actually, and you have Minibits, which is a wallet that makes you use eCash, Chaumian means like Cashew for small amounts, and then you can go up, and everything is integrated through Lightning as a routing system. So I don't see any way around. Of course, there are degrees, but these degrees that Matt was describing are all different kind of channels in a way, more trusted, less trusted. And as Matt noted, it's not like complexity is increasing in the direction of less sovereign. It's the other way around. The simple solution is the non-sovereign one. Is the Alfine solution. It's just trust me, bro. It's wallet of Satoshi. And in a way, Bitcoin on chain, which is the most sovereign, is not necessarily simple as a solution. We think that layer one Bitcoin is a simple UX, but because we are used to that, but it's not. Sending Bitcoin in a layer one on chain is terrible. You have UTXO selection problems, fee estimation problems. It's hell. It's Bitcoin base layer is not simple. In a way, for example, for a sender, Lightning UX is even simpler than Bitcoin on chain UX. For a receiver, maybe it's the other way around. So it's not really linear, this complexity stuff. And to finish my point, I disagree a little bit with John that every current proposal about changing the Bitcoin consensus go in the direction of more complexity. Actually, you can do payment pools right now with the punishment mechanism, but the complexity of those of hierarchic channel with the current construction, the complexity of that is incredible. If you switch to an L2 channel, even if you had to change, for example, the consensus, but now the complexity of a multi-party L2 channel is lower than the complexity of a current hierarchical channel structure. So some of the proposal changes, I agree with Matt, we will not see any or use any of that for many, many years. It's too early. We don't even get right the UX of Lightning, which is the easy part, and it's too early to do something like that. But eventually, if something like a consensus change will happen, it may be to reduce complexity. For example, moving from hierarchical channels to L2 multi-party.
Okay, I just want to flip back to you, John. Are you still massively pro Lightning?
I don't know what that means. We have a company. We support Lightning technology in our products. I do think that there's a use case for it. I think maybe the nature of your question I'll answer, which is I don't feel as magical about Lightning as I did when I first started promoting it. So when I worked at BitRefill and I was trying to promote them doing Thor, the first LSP that was selling channels, I was like, use Lightning now. It's ready. What's everybody waiting for? Be reckless. Let's go. But now, having been kind of in the trenches for a few years, that's not how I feel. I think there's a pretty high chance I'd like to avoid it, and I'd like to not live in this spectrum of pessimism. But there's a pretty high chance that Lightning will just end up being only used for like business, like B2B settlement, for actual high frequency relationships. That's possible. And the Lightning Network just might be large businesses that do high frequency transacting because it's just cheaper for them to settle with each other dynamically on Lightning than to worry about on-chain transactions or to establish credit terms. That, I think, is like the core use case of Lightning that will never go away. The rest of it, I think, is now to me more of an experiment and not something that we can say is guaranteed. The idea of using Lightning to bring Bitcoin to retail, to bring it to merchants, this kind of thing, which is a big part of why I'm interested in it. Not so sure anymore. It's really expensive. It's really complicated. It's a really bad user experience to some people. Like there's the edge of how great we can make the user experience just won't be tolerable to some people. And they'll just use custodial stuff, which will mean they're not really self-sovereign and they're not using real scaling solutions and opportunities.
I think there's so I strongly agree with you in general. That it may just be the case that Lightning won't have a good enough UX. The problem is we don't know how to build anything better. Lightning fundamentally, even if Lightning, all these hard problems that people talk about, the UX challenges, we can solve many of them. We're working on it. It'll take time, whatever. But the fees, at some point, somebody's got to pay a fee to put some money in the channel. And who pays that fee and whether those fees are low enough, maybe that just makes the UX too bad. It is worth pointing out, I think, that Lightning fees will always be cheaper than the prevailing on-chain fees, because you can always, at the end of the day, you're getting a compression ratio, right? You're getting some reduction in total blockchain space usage by using Lightning compared to just doing the same transactions on chain. So there's always some advantage, and for people who really need self-sovereignty, who really need to do transactions in a way that can't be censored, clearly the best option right now is Lightning, because the only other option is on-chain, and it's not clear that any of the technologies people are talking about building really solve the problem in a way that's more compelling than Lightning. I think there are designs that people have that solve the problem in a very compelling way, but that are a long ways away and have a lot of complexity involved and may never get there. And certainly the things that are kind of being built in the short term, things like Fediment, things like that are custodial, they just won't see the kind of self-sovereignty and certainly the kind of censorship resistance that some people are going to need. And so the question in my mind is always, how can we make Lightning as good as we can? And can we get it to the point where it is a really compelling user experience? And maybe we won't. I think we can solve basically all the problems but the fees. So we'll see.
I'm going to throw a few controversial questions, and I'll let anyone choose to take them as they want. Do we potentially overrate self-sovereignty in that we can build a system whereby there are people who can own UTXOs, they can have Bitcoin, but most people don't really care, and they would be happily with some kind of trusted, centralized version whereby somebody's custodying for them, and that will still be good enough. And with that, can we build a way of making that trust model work in that these, I don't know if it's between some kind of shared custody that builds a banking system on the front of it, or if it's, I don't know the actual answer, but should we treat owning a UTXO and being self-sovereign as a privilege and look at solutions where it still gives people exposure to the asset? Because that's essentially what an ETF is, really. It's the same thing.
I think two things. So there's two separate use cases of Bitcoin. There's people who want to invest because they want to hedge other risk, whether that's they don't trust the Fed or they don't trust existing macroeconomic policies, whatever it is. And then there's those who want to transact with it. And for those who want to transact with it, self-sovereignty is maybe not always critical, but certainly censorship resistance is. And the problem with all of the custodial and federated and whatever solutions is regulatory. I think in theory, if we could remove the regulatory issue entirely, then in many cases we would be fairly happy with users using these kind of solutions, whether it's a federated trust model, Liquid, Fediment, whatever, or a fully custodial one, Wallet of Satoshi, what have you. We'd be very happy with many users using those, especially for moderate to small value balances. But the reality is today, you can't build that and serve a very large segment of the world's population.
I would like, if you allow, John, I would like to directly connect here because I would disagree a little bit with you, Matt, about this. The problem, in my opinion, is that you can use Wallet of Satoshi in a way that seems completely without any kind of governance and regulation problems for a while. And that's the problem. I connect back to the comment by John about LARPing. The reason we are LARPing about self-custody and users don't care is that in most cases, they still have the privilege not to care. Basically, there is no anybody yet actively trying to stopping Albi and Wallet of Satoshi outside the US. And custodials are still basically allowed without strong travel rule enforcement and KYC enforcement. This is getting worse and worse every year. So every year there are more risks involved, more obstacles, but that's the trend. But for now, people just want custody because custody is simple and is permitted. But then the best allied for sovereign Bitcoin is just the state making it not permitted. So if custodians are permitted to serve the market, then there is no problem. Just go and use custodians. Sometimes there will be a rug pull, but in other moments it will be fine. So the problem is only when the states tries to censor self-custody. But if that's the case, you will see that incentive to do self-custody will suddenly increase. So people that get censored and excluded from Wallet of Satoshi, from Albi, from everything else, they will rediscover the importance to pay for self-sovereignty. So we don't need to sponsor it as a solution for them right now. They don't want it because they have simple alternatives for now. But then eventually these simple alternatives go away. What we may try to address is the fact that this change in permission levels may be sudden, may be abrupt, may be too fast, and so many people could get hurt from snapshot censorship, in which basically you just up to a moment you are free, and then you are not, and then you have this shotgun KYC things or stuff like that. So this is the problem. This is why the design that Matt was talking about degrees in which the wallet will guide the user across different degrees is very nice, because you will stay on the simple, good UX, low fee kind of design as much as you are allowed to stay, as long as you are allowed. And then if it falls, you may easier fall back on other use cases because your money is more, or because your external conditioning to become self-sovereign becomes more important. So what we need is not to keep self-sovereignty always at the maximum, because self-sovereignty cannot compete with the simplicity of custodians, of trust. Trust is the simplest thing. What you need, what we need is to build a system in which attacks on trust fall back gracefully into trustlessness, which has a cost. It will never be comparable to trust. It will always be more expensive, more clumsy, more complicated, because trust is very, very simple. So it's a little bit like we need to build a system that, if needed, can go back to in the spectrum of self-sovereignty. But it's natural that users will stay there. It's not a failure mode. It's just a natural thing, because they can, and as much as they can. I even, like, for example, I tend to use self-sovereign Lightning wallets all the time. I did it all these 2 months to pay. But when I'm on Nostr and I have to receive a ZEP, the use case is very difficult on Lightning right now, because it's basically a synchronous payment. I'm not online to receive that tip. So to do that, I do use Albi. But because I can, nobody is censoring me yet. Yesterday, I received an email from the friends from Albi, which I basically reached my limit of tips on the custodial version. So, okay, I have to make the effort to really connect my CLN node, which is complicated, but I can do it with a rune and commando or something. I never had the time to do it. I will have to do it, because now I'm forced.
So I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance on this level. And even in this call, like, you guys keep referring to this gray area, or this degrading. Well, I think the context is important here, because on one hand, you have people saying Bitcoin is uncensorable. Bitcoin fixes this. Bitcoin, the supply cap can't be changed, blah, blah, blah. It's this unchangeable, anti-fragile thing. And on the other hand, you have people quoting Hal Finney saying Bitcoin banks are the way that Bitcoin will be in the future, that Fedimint is amazing because it's scaling Bitcoin. And you have all these people that are taking things that aren't actually Bitcoin, that are custodial, and they're conflating it with the Bitcoin mission. And I think within the Bitcoin mission, all of that stuff is a LARP. There is no gray. It is entirely black and white. You are either self-sovereign or you are not. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that banks as a concept are evil, that trusting is evil. I don't believe that at all. I think trust is awesome. A big part of our work is in finding ways to digitize trust to help people make better decisions and more relevance in what they do. But it's not Bitcoin. And the problem with any future where we accept that any significant portion of Bitcoin is within custody, and that's part of the design, then what we're doing is LARPing, because all we're doing is we're saying, well, the old system was fine, and except instead of elites, running federal banks, they're just going to run Bitcoin. And that's the inevitable end. So we really do have to figure out how to get as many people in here as possible using Bitcoin on-chain, off-chain with Lightning, whatever, self-sovereign in a self-sovereign way, because there is a hard line to once you start to trust, it doesn't matter how. It doesn't matter if it's with Bitcoin or fiat or shitcoins. It just matters who. That's the only thing that matters when you're trusting. So let's just respect that line. And if you want to have conversations about banking technology, custody technology. If that's your interest, great. Just leave it out of my Bitcoin conversation. Another issue with all, sorry, just one quick thing I wanted to mention earlier was another issue with all of this is you get a lot of payment incompatibility. So you don't actually solve any of the problems because every different payment protocol you use and every different asset within every different payment protocol you use is an incompatible payment format. And so now you just have to include exchanges. You have to include centralization as conversion points. Those are totally censorable. So you have all this. And if you don't use exchanges, you have coordination problems. So you just have a lot of problems where if you try to use many things, you're just always going to have a bad user experience and never get mass adoption.
So I think there's a few points to be made here. You mentioned that there's no gray area between self-sovereign and not, and I think maybe we need to use different terminology here. There's gray areas in terms of the security model you might be using. So Lightning is clearly a different, and I would say lighter or darker, depending on which way you want to make the shades go. Security model than on-chain Bitcoin. You have to be online, you have to check regularly, maybe you have to use a watchtower or whatever it is. It's a very different security model, but I would argue it's still censorship resistant. I think to your broader point here was kind of that this isn't Bitcoin because Bitcoin must have certain properties. And I think chief among them, you would rank censorship resistance, right? That people must be able to transact without any third party being able to stop them. I would state Bitcoin's mission a little more broadly, right? Bitcoin's mission is to remove trust in some way that you need it. So someone chooses to use Bitcoin because they are choosing not to trust some third party that they might otherwise need to trust. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean censorship resistance. It doesn't necessarily have to mean the ability to transact. It might mean they don't trust the Fed. It might mean they don't trust their central bank, whatever country they're in. And they want to use simply a different payment rail that's denominated in a different currency, but are happily willing to trust some bank or some other system. That's not a use case of Bitcoin I spend time building software for. I don't care too much about that. I think that's a well-served use case of Bitcoin. People are going to have options there. But it is, I think, a valid use case for Bitcoin. If you're avoiding trust in some way that you couldn't avoid in the existing system, and Bitcoin is providing material value to your life or investment portfolio in one way or another. And I think that's cool. Bitcoin's still providing you value. But the censorship resistance, you're right. I don't think censorship resistance is super filled with gray areas. I think it at the end of the day, your transaction went through, your transaction didn't go through. And that's not super gray. That's pretty black and white. But the trust models required to get to that point are filled with gray areas.
I would simply argue that 100% of the qualities of Bitcoin are lost in custody. So I get what you're trying to say, that somebody may only want a certain quality of Bitcoin, and that quality might not be censorship resistance. It might be some other quality, but all the qualities are lost in custody. Even the supply cap. I don't think there are any qualities left in custody because you're just making the leap to trusted. And so if you're making the leap to trusted, you are trusting all of the qualities of Bitcoin to that person, not just, one particular one.
You absolutely are. The difference is you can choose who you trust. In the existing system, you often can't.
Right. I'm just kind of on a mission to get people to focus on that's the problem, is who to trust, not how. That's my interest. Is let's just stop talking about and getting all excited about all these new ways to trust people. It's just not as interesting as Bitcoiners want it to be.
You're right. It's not super interesting. I think it is still valid, and I think people should absolutely use Bitcoin in that way if it's adding value to their life.
I think that here I'm unofficially agreeing with Matt, but officially agree with John in this sense. So basically, I think that a realistic discussion will basically see a lot of gray areas, because even Bitcoin on chain is not a perfect security model against confiscation or even against inflation. There are some failure modes in everything, including blockchain, the Bitcoin time chain. So layer one single address Bitcoin is not perfect security model, perfect censorship resistant. If the miners start to mine empty chains for 3 years, your on-chain or on-chain address will be censored basically. So it's never perfect. It's very, very good at censorship resistant and inflation control, but there are inflation bugs and stuff like that. The more you move toward custody, the more you are exposed to these security model failures. In the case of a bank, of somebody telling you, just trust me, bro, the probability of a fractional reserve is very, very high, and the probability of censorship is very, very high. In the case of the ETF, they already told you that they will probably do fractional reserve and censorship, so it's not even a question. In the case of Wallet of Satoshi, you can rely more or less or something. So the realistic discussion is that this spectrum does exist, and there is and we should just push the users on this part of the spectrum how much is possible, whenever possible, wherever possible. But we cannot pretend it doesn't exist, because Bitcoin layer 1 is not even at the end of the spectrum. It's just at the end of the realistic spectrum, but it's not at the end of the ideal spectrum of perfect censorship resistance. But officially, I agree with John for one single reason. Going in this direction, the direction of trust, is instinctively simple. It will happen spontaneously. We don't even need to discuss it. We don't even have to really push for it. Going in the other direction is usually expensive and painful, and you have to be patient. It entails a lot of more complexity. So in a way, the idea that Bitcoiner push everybody in this direction, even with not realistic, is reasonable, because like cultural discussion is not about representing everything, but is about pushing toward the like long-term low-term preference choices. When you discuss, you don't tell your children, yes, you have to find a job and work hard, but you also have sometimes to get stoned. That's true. You have to stay in the balance. But the only part that you tell them is the hard part, because this is the part where it's needed for you to try to push. So we don't need to push people in the center. We need to push people to an extreme in order to achieve the center as a result, because it's not realistic to achieve the extreme. The extreme doesn't even exist in the layer 1.
Yeah, I like that. I would say the direction should always be to unbank the banked, not to bank the unbanked.
Yeah. But when we discuss engineering, and people will come up with failure modes in which you can make better custody, I mean, that's naturally happening in the engineering discussion, because you have to be realistic. So the official branding should be always self-custody. No discussion. It's like, the mid-width curve all over again. The low IQ people will just tell you it's all self-custody. Bitcoin is perfectly censorship resistant. Then the mid-widths will start to tell you, but actually Alfine predicted that we'll have, which is true, but it's not convenient to tell in public. And then the galaxy brain will understand that in very like intellectual situations like these, in which Peter's audience is the intellectual elite of Bitcoin, we can afford to touch nuances. But every time we go out from this secluded place and we have to talk with actual users, we have just to always be annoying and pushing for self-custody.
You're giving away the plot there, Giacomo. It's a broadly listened podcast. You can't give away the plot then.
Is it it's one of the challenges that we have, is that as Bitcoin has grown and adoption has grown, we essentially have decentralized narratives, we have decentralized ideals and decentralized education, and therefore there's people can hear a whole host of things, and without that kind of consensus of opinion of what's right, it can be confusing.
Absolutely.
Should we elect a leader, Giacomo, the great leader of Bitcoin? This is what you should do.
I don't like democracy. I would just self-appoint. And
I definitely get fatigue. Like, there are times when I'm happy to be on Twitter defending my mental model for Bitcoin and defending self-sovereignty and all these ideals and things like this. And there are times where I'm just like, you know what? I get much more reward out of just working more. And that's and the longer I'm in Bitcoin, the more I trend towards being much more interested in building and much less interested in what people on Twitter think. And so if you're not there, in the trenches with the new people learning about Bitcoin, teaching them, then you're going to get newer people teaching them. And so, or more fragmented. And so, even if I had the time to spend all my time trying to educate people in public, I still would only reach a small portion of people. So it's like, there's no way to centralize and idealize Bitcoin education and experience. It's just something that just takes years, and it takes years for everybody. And nobody in their first year thinks it takes years.
And at the end of the day, people are going to use what works for them. So if we build the right solutions, if we build the solutions that are censorship resistant and are self-sovereign and meet the ideals that we want, and we improve the UX as much as we can, and we hopefully have really good UX with these solutions, then, people will use them. And that's all that matters.
So should we not worry too much? Is it a bit like that shitcoin rider passage that people have sometimes? They go down the shitcoin rabbit hole and they end up realizing they should have just held Bitcoin and not traded it. Is custody similar in that some people may start with the worst custody solution? They might leave it on an exchange, or they might have it in an ETF. But over time, as they get exposed to rug pulls, whether personally or seeing it in the news, they start to realize that, hold on a second, maybe I need a hardware wallet, or maybe I need a multi-sig solution, or whatever new solutions come down the road. Is it just a rite of passage?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen that with a lot of users. We've certainly seen people buy on Coinbase or something, and then they hold it there for a while, and then 6 months later they say, oh yeah, actually I kind of want to get my coins off of here.
I think it is with a caveat though, like we have to accept that people mostly learn from mistakes and from pain. I did it with shitcoins in 2013. Most people did it with shitcoin custody or whatever. We learn by making mistakes and suffering. And this will always be the way, always. What education is about is trying to short circuit a little bit of that learning process in order to use the pain of people of the past to diminish a little bit the pain of people of the future. So education is basically, at first I just eat all the berries and then some of us will die in our tribe. And now we try to pass down the knowledge in a way that you can actually know that these berries are poisonous without dying first. So we are just trying to reduce the pain by passing down the message. So this is inherently some kind of endless effort that will never work 100%. People will basically try, people will get robbed, people will get scammed, and you cannot avoid that or get too mad at that. What you can try to do is just to use your past experience to try to shorten some path or some learning path for somebody else. And in this sense, of course, good coordination among Bitcoiners is precious. Like one of the problems we are trying to address with the Plan B network is that in a decentralized context of educators, everybody is reinventing Bitcoin 101. So it's very difficult to build on other people's stuff and to do the second step, the third step, because everybody starts from scratch and everybody tends to reinvent the wheels. So we're trying to put people together and to create one single place where you can have all the Summer of Bitcoin education plus all the Lisa's and Jimmy's courses plus all the stuff in one single place. But that's centralization is always efficient but fragile. So if you centralize education a little bit, you can cut the noise a little bit. You can become more efficient, cut the redundancy and the waste. But then when this group of educators start to go on the wrong path, they will basically be unstoppable for a while, and you will need another group of educators taking over. So centralization is efficient but dangerous.
Can I ask my most controversial question? And John's going to be expecting this one. I think Giacomo will as well. Have we written off the entire idea of ever scaling on layer one? Is this too sensitive a topic to even bring up? Is there too much PTSD to even raise that as a point? I'm going to start with you, Giacomo, and then I'm going to go to Matt and come to you last, John, because we've spoken about this.
I again have to be a little bit nuanced about the answer. I think that technically speaking, not at all. Most of the small blockers during the scaling wars were mostly okay with the future possible increase of the block size. It was never really a matter of is this possible or desirable. It will come a time in which 4 megabytes blocks that we have now with SegWit and every 10 minutes are unreasonable considering the latency of the network, the propagation rate, and the validation CPU bandwidth kind of constraint. The discussion was always not even when and how much, but always about the method, and always about the way to get there. In a way, SegWit 2x was about doubling with a hard fork the block size, and SegWit no 2x, which was the small blocker field, was basically making 4x the actual size, which is what we have now. It's just a theoretical limits, but with spam we did reach it, a 4 megabyte block. So
Giacomo, just to interrupt very quickly, and are you basically saying if any solutions come as a soft fork, they're a lot more palatable? It's the idea of a hard fork which becomes
is the hard fork is who decides the hard fork? Like, is New York Agreement was a list of business, influential American and Chinese business trying to force feed something. So it's a matter of process, of narrative. Like, are you honest in the narrative? Are you screaming that the sky is falling, so I'm forced to upgrade, or you're just honestly debating pros and cons? So it's a matter of method. The problem is that this matter of method is not just about soft fork and hard fork. It could also be about impossibility to coordinate consensus changes anymore without a very strong, at least moral authority. Back then, during the scaling wars, the moral authority was the somehow cohesive group of Bitcoin core developers, with few exceptions, that basically cut themselves out, like Mike Hearn and Gavin Andresen. So we had the moral authority. Right now, we could be at a level in which we all think that actually a block size increase may be reasonable at a certain point, but getting consensus for that will require a level of coordination that we cannot afford anymore, and which is an attack vector in itself, possibly. So I think that from an engineering point of view, the idea that 4 megabytes is some holy limit is stupid, because also it's not even 1 megabyte anymore. We did increase the block. So it's like a fetish that, again, the low IQ people will defend it like a fetish. The midwit will say, oh, but this is just a fetish, we can just change it. And the galaxy brains may realize that the process to change it may become so hard in the future that may we end up with 4 megabytes blocks forever, not because it's the right decision, but because we don't have a process in place to change this decision in an effective way without collapses of the consensus model.
Yeah, I mean, I think I largely agree with what Giacomo had to say. I don't know what the process would even look like. I don't even want to begin to think about what the process would look like. In theory, it's not something that's out of the question. I think it's important to recognize a few things. I think it's important to recognize that, first of all, we will never scale via any kind of on-chain block size increase. There has to be a compelling, multiplicative factor on top, right? Lightning is one where, you can do a lot of transactions and it only ends up being one on-chain transaction. Potentially, maybe we talked about fees and the LSP overhead, maybe that multiplicative factor is fairly small. Maybe we'll need something bigger, right? Because, I think Giacomo mentioned previously, it doesn't take a computer science degree to understand this concept that if every computer in the Bitcoin network needs to see every single transaction that happens in the Bitcoin world, it doesn't scale. That's not a complicated concept to understand, that you can't copy everything onto every computer and expect this to work. So we need factors on top. It's also important to recognize that we shouldn't think about increasing the block size in response to shorter term changes. I would say the biggest limiting factor in the block size has nothing to do with scalability. It has to do with paying fees. That we have in Bitcoin decided to have a limited fixed amount of Bitcoin. And if we want to maintain that, we absolutely have to have a limited block size in order to force people to pay for the security budget of Bitcoin. We have to pay miners. While we cannot scale technically to a large number of transactions via on-chain block size increases, we also, we probably could increase that number relatively higher than we might otherwise, just based on the fact that we have to pay miners. So we also can't do changes to the block size on the basis of, the fees are too high right now. We have to do it on the basis of where the fees are going to be in a decade, or 2 decades. And I think it's hopefully fairly clear that BRC20 and this concept of like people creating tokens by proving that they can pay miners fees is not something that's going to be here in a decade. This isn't, the current fee rate run up has lasted quite a while, but suggesting that it's going to last a decade or even last another 5 years is kind of absurd to me. So it's sadly not something that we can respond to with these kinds of responses. So I don't know. Bitcoin fundamentally only works if there is material demand for block space, and that demand, I would say at least marginally outstrips the supply in some way that generates real revenue for miners. And I don't think we are at the point where that is true today of Bitcoin, of people using Bitcoin in a sustainable way. So it's not a conversation that makes sense to be had right now, even just on a purely technical level, if we ignore all of the points Giacomo raised about consensus and how we discuss changing the block size. Sadly, that means a lot of pain right now in terms of on-chain fees, and it has caused a lot of real issues for people trying to use Lightning, trying to use Bitcoin in general. And I don't have a great answer to that, and that sucks.
Well, John, we discussed this. This was the starting point of why we're having this conversation. I know you've got some unique views on this.
So I think there's a lot of nuance needed in conversations like this. I'm glad that these are the people you invited and we were able to speak with so much nuance so far. I think that this kind of nuance is definitely required for this part of the conversation and for Bitcoiners that want to be, I guess, good Bitcoiners or educated Bitcoiners or useful, helpful, etc. For me, and I think what should be for everybody, the difference between like prescribing, a solution and speculating on a solution. If I come to you, if I came went on Twitter tomorrow and said, I demand blocks be 8 megabytes, I demand that we should use this format of extension blocks to do it or whatever, like everybody's going to like reject it and be against it, and there will be no nuance and it'll just be dead. But Bitcoin has these things like that are called magic numbers inside, and people tend to think of them as arbitrarily set or set once in the past and never to be thought about again. But they can be informed. They can be, rationally chosen numbers. And as we've learned, they can also be changed sometimes, and they can be changed with soft fork schemes. And so we have to be mature about this kind of thing and basically facilitate and encourage research into the actual costs of running nodes, the demographics of the costs of people that would run nodes in different areas of the world, different classes, etc. So we can identify where we actually are with Bitcoin scaling and say, look, Bitcoin has reached a kind of limit here where we have say the whole global south would use it if the fees were maybe 20% less, because looking at the demographics, this is where it would be affordable for them to actually have a computer and disk space and bandwidth, etc. And so we can actually research this information. It would in the end be trusted because somebody has to collect and compile the information, but we can develop a kind of culture of understanding which people are being excluded by Bitcoin costs and which people could be included where certain costs to be adjusted. And it's not just about transaction fees. Like some people want to say, well, I can't use Bitcoin because I can't afford the fees, or we don't want to make it so people can't use Bitcoin because they can't afford to run a node. Well, these are two very different cost perspectives. Like saying I can't, a $25 fee is extremely exclusive. It excludes a lot of people. It excludes a lot of activity. A $25 a month fee to run a Bitcoin node, but $1 fees for transactions is less exclusive. And so we have to actually compare these dynamics and say, are we biting off our nose despite our face, by being overly worried about node costs, when the real problem is that transaction costs are exclusive. And so we have to weigh these things and be informed about the nuances of these things so we can actually see when we are reaching the limit. I agree with Matt that I don't actually think that ordinals have proven that we found the limit. I don't think we need a block size increase right now. I do think that there's a certain weather aspect to this and the supply and demand, and there's an unusual amount of demand right now. But I think we'll reach a point where it's just like, okay, it's stupid now. You know what I mean? Everybody is going to be excluded at some price. If the price keeps going up, you're just going to exclude more and more people, whether it be the cost to run a node or the cost to send a transaction. But both are real, and the cost to run a node is actually like we talked about complexity earlier. To calculate the cost of implementing Lightning and doing all the research and development and all of the work that's put into it so far in the past 5-6 years, the cost of doing the transactions, blah, 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 all this like industry cost, to compare it to, say, for example, if we had chosen a route of formalizing specifications for zero confirmation transactions to enable merchant payments to be something where they can limit their exposure, increasing the block size to where we kept transaction fees down to a reasonable level. If we compared those costs, I think you would probably find that the overall costs, at least, are much lower in the on-chain scaling version. Now, this is all within a context, right? At other contexts, that would be totally wrong. So there's just all of this kind of tolerance measuring that we have to be aware of and respectful of to see that, okay, it really would be silly not to increase the block size at some point. I think we won't necessarily need all of that research and awareness because the market truly will just demand it. It'll just be obvious. It'll just be like, look, Bitcoin fees have been $1,000 a transaction for 6 months, and the Bitcoin price is plummeting, and there's all kinds of bad, vibes about Bitcoin throughout the community. It's a dying thing. We have to fix it. The trick is between prescription and speculation that, if you solve the problem early, then you don't have the pain. But if you speculate and solve the problem early and are wrong, you create tragedy of the commons and cost to the existing user base. So it's a delicate thing that requires nuance, that requires maturity, that people should be looking at very closely. And I think this area of research is way more interesting than custodial solutions and federations and such. It's more taboo. But I do think that there is meaningful, realistic, scientific, mature, intelligent stuff that could be researched there that is not. I think pretty much James Lopp is the only one even looking at all at Bitcoin this way when he does his research of, doing initial block downloads, checking all the different implementations, things like this. Sorry, that's end of my rant. I'm losing my voice.
Yeah, I think you're right. We may reach that point. I think it's very unclear. I think the most interesting. So I should avoid making it sound like I speak for other engineers in the broader Bitcoin community, because I know there are many who are much more concerned about the long-term UTXO growth, right? That the block size can create long-term UTXO growth, and that this can outpace the reduction in cost and storage. I'm not as concerned about that. I know others are, to each their own, whatever. But I think, to your point, in terms of research, we would need to see kind of where we're going in terms of on-chain fees and whether the block size makes sense. I think at some point we need to have a serious conversation about modeling where transaction demand comes from. And right now, obviously, there's hype around ordinals and all kinds of other things that probably don't have staying power. Certainly, BRC20. Whether you think that ordinals or inscriptions have staying power is one thing, but this kind of just pure shitcoin fair minting by paying Bitcoin on-chain fees protocol probably will not have staying power. So the question is where do we get the transaction fees, and what will block space demand volume, and what does that block space demand curve look like? What is the demand at different price points? And that's something that's super complicated to answer. I don't think anyone could even answer that question today. But there is some research that some people have done. People have tried to answer the question a little differently and say, what if every person in the world were to get a Lightning channel, how much block space do we need? If every person in the world were to need to splice in X amount of Bitcoin or splice out X amount of Bitcoin from their Lightning channel on a, yearly or monthly basis, how much block space do we need? And the result of some of those models has been surprisingly little to me, that we need fairly little block space in total to get everyone a Lightning channel. Not so much everyone a Lightning channel that they're going to splice in and out of a lot. And so you make certain assumptions around the liquidity of LSPs and availability of capital to make those Lightning channels very long-lived and not need a lot of on-chain transactions on a regular basis. But, I've always been surprised when you do the numbers there that the total block space doesn't need to be that high. But, where you have to see where demand comes from and what demand looks like and what that demand curve looks like specifically. Because we're just not even, I don't think we have even a reasonably good guess as to what Bitcoin looks like in 5 years, in 10 years, certainly as to how people are using Bitcoin. So I on one hand, I agree with you that more research would be nice. On the other hand, I'm not even sure how one would go about doing some of that research today.
Yeah, I'm just kind of hoping if the whole culture was moving in that direction, the answers would be emergent. You know what I mean? As long as we're being nuanced and being mature and being intelligent, we'll see what makes the most sense, and there will be some sort of rough consensus about it. But if we just treat it all as taboo and focus on, narratives that say, well, Bitcoin banks are part of the solution, then you just deter that research,
Okay, let me be a little bit contrarian here. While I do agree that from a prescription point of view, screaming that the sky is falling, we need the giga blocks is craziness. But from a speculative point of view, it will be mature to get over the knee-jerk reaction from the fork war and to just start discussing stuff. I agree with John that the magical numbers are magical and so are to a degree arbitrary, and it could be a little bit off in one direction or the other. One interesting field of research will be to try to move away from magical numbers in general. For example, there is an old proposal from Manny Rosenfeld about elastic block size, which will not converge over a specific Goldilocks zone, but will basically try to find a dynamic way to react from fee levels, which could be more interesting. It was in a proposal that was not very easily gameable by miners, so it could be more interesting. So I agree that it shouldn't be taboo, at least in technical discussion. It could be taboo in memes, because memes are more simple and they're meant to convey a simple thing. But in serious discussion, it should not be taboo. And the size or the process to get to the size. For elastic block size is nice, because one of the problem with one-off increases or with time-dependent increases is that we are assuming a technological direction for our civilization. When we have a technological shock, then we have problems with our assumption, and we may not have it. But so the Hellenistic thought before the Hellenistic Dark Ages, and everybody was fine in Terra before the Vulcan exploded, and everybody was back to the Stone Age. So flexible and elastic solution may be a thing. But I disagree with both that the main source of research should be the demand, because the demand will always be as much as they can. The demand is possibly unlimited, while the realistic supply of good UX and good security and good level of censorship resistance is limited by reality. So I think that I will flip it around. Like, how much can we afford to decrease the fees is possible from a security budget point of view, from a latency point, orphan rate point of view, and from a selfish mining point of view. So I think one of the characteristics of the small blockers in the past war was starting not from what users wants, but starting from what is possible to give them without breaking Bitcoin. Because if we do break Bitcoin, it's true that what John says, that at a certain point we're pricing out everybody, even if there is a caveat there that I will mention. But it's true that we are pricing out from the on-chain transaction more and more people. But if we break, for example, Bitcoin decentralization in the process of giving the market what they want, then there is not even the last elite of people remaining without this with this tool. So if the realistic choice in between a very small elite having Bitcoin and all the world getting to something which is closer to PayPal, there is a realistic debate to be had about preferring the first solution over the second. And I think I would probably prefer the first solution. I will prefer a few banks being able to keep censorship resistance as opposed to everybody losing it to a degree. The second disagreement will be that if we want to check demand, and if we want to be as much as able as possible to concede to the demand, we don't have to just look at of the demand of people that want to send Bitcoin, but also at the demand of people that want to receive Bitcoin. And in this particular case, I disagree with John completely, because I think that right now sending Bitcoin, it may be expensive. Like putting Bitcoin in a Lightning channel could be $50. It's a lot for basically the global South. It's a lot, but running a node is actually more expensive in terms of resources right now. You need a kind of computer and connection that most of the people that cannot afford $50 to open a Lightning channel cannot afford as well. If we think about how many people cannot spend Bitcoin right now, and so they move to custodial solutions instead, there is a large amount of people, more and more every year, are priced out, and they have to use custodial solutions. But if we think about how many people are outpriced from the possibility to receive Bitcoin trustlessly, which is just as important as sending them. If you don't run a node, you are basically trusting as much as a wallet of Satoshi user. You are trusting miners that they are telling you gracefully if you are receiving or not. You are still trusting basically 5 companies instead of one. So if you receive money on wallet of Satoshi, you trust one company. If you receive money with SPV, you trust 5 mining pools. But that's not a great improvement. So receiving is as much important as sending. And if we basically if I talk with people right now in El Salvador or in Switzerland, and I ask how many people can't spend on chain, there are a few people that are priced out. If I ask how many people can't, with their realistic cost benefit analysis, run a Bitcoin node, many more people are just using a cell phone app that cannot run a full node because nobody is running AB Core on a normal cell phone. So everybody's basically they are all trusting somebody else to receive Bitcoin. This is equally important. That said, the last point will be, it's not true that eventually we will price anybody out of Bitcoin. I think it's true that we will price anybody out of moving single UTXOs alone. I think that's inevitable for the reason that Matt said before. There is no way such a system with N square kind of growth, cost growth can scale to anybody. You can change off a small constant factor. You can improve a little bit less, but it's still not scaling. So the only way to scale, as Matt said before, will be UTXO sharing. I hope it will be trustless or seriously trust minimized UTXO sharing, because in that case, we can scale in a very open way. For example, every time Matt said, every time we open a Lightning channel, we save fees because we have to pay for the open and for the close, but we don't pay for everything in between. So we are basically batching. But there is more. We are also, in theory, able to share the opening and closing fee among 2, especially if we are both consenting to the closing. In theory, we both want to use this channel, so we can share the cost among 2. So among 2 people, the amount of batching and the amount of fee sharing is reduced, of course. But if we go to 3, 4, 5 people, we can actually, or 100 people, we can share not only the opening and closing fee. So, for example, assuming that, for example, we have to open a channel and we are $1,000 fees, in theory, could be shared among 1,000 people with $1 of fee. Of course, it's tricky because now you have to get the UTXO from these people entering. So you create a lot of complexity. But let's put it this way. We increase the surface of cases in which people can and is incentivized to share the fees. It's not like everybody will magically share these fees trivially, but basically the collision events in which people can be interested in sharing fees can grow, not with a number of participants, but very close to that.
You went on a lot of tangents and I didn't want to interrupt, but so I took notes. But first of all, fee sharing is such bullshit. Like, this is one of the reasons why I just don't believe in UTXO sharing. If you think that you're going to create user experience where you can coordinate fee sharing across many participants and have that actually like reach some kind of scale, you're crazy. It's never going to happen.
No, you can't.
It's
just
not
asymmetric. You cannot do that symmetrically. You can do it with
possible. It's like lightning, though. It's just past lightning. Like the idea that you're going to coordinate all of this and actually make it true, it's only going to be done like in a very, very centralized way. Like that's the only way.
That's true. That's true. It will be LSP based. It will never be totally peer to peer. But
I just like, I don't know how to make a bet with you on this. I don't even like making real bets. A gentleman's bet that if we do ever have such a thing, more than 80% of the closes will be single unilateral exits, and they will not, and less than 20% will be coordinated multi-party exits and multi-party changes. I just don't think that's realistic to look at that way. I also want to mention that you portrayed the gap between SPV wallets and custody as being only like 5 steps away. I think it's a huge gap. I think that holding your own keys, although not running a node, is way, way better than custodial. Like they're not even comparable. That's how I see it. And then finally, ideals are about directions. They're not destinations. And a lot of your argument presents ideals as like the only acceptable outcome. And so I think it's more about like saying, for example, Bitcoin is just not interesting to me if it's for elites. If Bitcoin banks and Hal Finney's vision of the future and Bitcoin fees being thousands or bajillions of dollars is the way it plans out, and that's what the consensus is taking Bitcoin towards, I'm not interested anymore. I just don't think it's interesting at all. It's like, okay, cool, we made a digital asset, made a digital commodity. Well, digital commodities in themselves can be printed, as we've seen with shitcoins. So it's just like, it just becomes like a lot of bullshit if it's centralized. And so I think the direction always needs to be about inclusive. In other words, we need to, rather than excluding things and moving towards higher and higher fees and fewer participants, we should always be trying to figure out how to move to increase the quantity of participants. And as long as, and that's the behind all of my arguments in my mental model is the assumption of that direction where we're trying to make Bitcoin a solution for everyone. It doesn't mean that we'll be able to include everyone. It just means that's the direction we're going in. And so that's why I'm so like against all this custodial conversation and bringing it into this conversation, because to me, it is black and white and it's going in the other direction. I don't want to go in that direction. We're leaving that direction.
Just a flash before you, Matt, so I can leave you for the full response, just a small flash of response here. I think that if we want to focus on the possibility of increasing a little bit of a small factor, the access to on-chain spending, which would be always a super elite because of the entire design. I don't believe it's even conceivable to have scaling on a global consensus system. But if we want to go in that direction, a little bit for a constant factor, a better research area than analyzing the demand, which I think is the no-go, because the point is the realism of supply, not really the demand, will be actually something like zero sync. So if we can make syncing with compact proofs as almost as secure as running a node, or indefinitely close to running a node, then the discussion about block size changes completely. If you can run a compact zero knowledge proof that can prove you the block headers without just trusting 5 pools, I think there you can have a total change in the amount of acceptable block size increase proposals. But that would be the direction I will look in if it was realistic and when it became realistic. Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, I don't have anything against with that idea. I agree that more research and more types of on-chain scaling improvements, aside from just changing magic numbers, should be part of that, part of the research. I think that, for example, I know there are edges to this, but like I think snapshotting on-chain shouldn't be taboo, and something that is probably something that could be pulled off with a good design, meaning that the concept of a full archival node is merely a curiosity and not a necessity. It would require, like, at some point, generations trusting old generations for the snapshots.
Weird mountain fantasy. You are very close to say weird mountain fantasy.
Well, in other words, it's just a fractal. It's just a fractal design comparing to pruning your own.
No, but you get the quotation, like a mountain man, weird mountain man fantasy, right?
No, I don't. Oh yeah, Weird Mountain Man Fantasy. This is a Vitalik thing. Yeah. But I think there's possibility still there. I'm not qualified to say there's none there or it's definitely there. Other than that, there's probably a lot of areas of interest that open up once you open up your mind and allow yourself to do that kind of research. That's all.
I'm conscious of time, and this has been fascinating. I haven't understood all of it, but what stands out to me is one, that there needs to be a lot of research done for various solutions and ideas, and two, it feels like I'll put this as a question so you can all finish up. I'll start with Matt. Do you feel like this is just the natural course for Bitcoin? We're just at one of those times where we're figuring things out because it is this new decentralized system for value transfer, and this is going to keep happening during the lifestyle of Bitcoin? Or do you think we're at a very tough spot, and therefore there should be much more like focus on increased investment in research and finally, just kind of what do you hope to see coming up? With regards to scaling in the near and really the near future.
Yeah. No, I do think this is a tough spot because not necessarily technically. We have spent, the ecosystem has spent a lot and invested a lot in scaling better, whether it's simple things like better batching of transactions from exchanges to investing in Lightning and supporting Lightning. We're in a good spot technologically, and I'm glad we've made all the investments we have. But Bitcoin is in a place right now where people are looking more and more to adopt it. It has brand recognition almost globally, and getting whacked in the face by this nonsense of BRC20 and related projects driving up fees in a non-sustainable way is really hurting. It's really hurting people trying to adopt Bitcoin who might have adopted Bitcoin and are now instead just using Tether or some other system that's even worse. So that sucks. That said, I don't know that there's a lot I would think we should do differently. So, the ecosystem has, again, it's invested a lot in these different types of scaling technologies, whether it's just smarter wallets on chain, whether it's investing in Lightning, or whether it's, there's increased discussion of what can we build with covenants. I continue to be a little disappointed by the conversation focusing on how do we activate covenants now, and not very focused on what can we actually build with these things, and let's actually gameplay a bunch of different things we could potentially build that would really scale Bitcoin, and then try to figure out what covenants we should try to activate. But I think that conversation is really important. Things like payment pools, things like I think both John and Giacomo agreed that as we move towards many party UTXO ownership, it will probably in large part be fairly centralized. And I think some of that's okay. Centralization with, if we can really pull off centralization where you can actually take your money and go home and no one can stop you from taking your money out and starting your own Lightning node subject to on-chain fees, that's a great system, and we can potentially get a lot of the benefits of centralization, a lot of the lower complexity system designs, while also having, censorship resistance, true censorship resistance, that someone can take their money and do whatever they want with it, subject to on-chain fees, as long as we have reasonably priced on-chain fees. There's a lot of research that is ongoing there. I want to continue to see more of it. I think these kinds of designs are going to end up being where we end up, but it might take a while because actually building these things, and John talked about the complexity of building these user experiences where things gracefully degrade from one technology to another is, a massive amount of complexity. It's a ton of complexity in Lightning, and then we add these other layers on top that each have their own complexity, and then we have to do all the bridging, and it has to be low fee, and users have to be it has to be seamless. That's really hard, and it's going to take a long time before we get there. So yes, I'm very frustrated with the situation we find ourselves in. I'm not happy about it, but I am happy that there is investment available for engineers to research these topics, that people are researching these topics, that hopefully we will come to some conclusions about other things to build besides Lightning that are somewhere in between the custodial Fediment or liquid angle and Lightning, and that we will start building in that area. But that is going to take a lot of time, and for now I'm just frustrated, and there's not a lot I can do to change that. And there's not a lot any of us can do to change that aside from, fund OpenSats, fund Brink, learn if you're an engineer, do research in this space. If you're friends with engineers, encourage them to do research in this space. If there's engineers who aren't in Bitcoin yet, go do the Chain Code Lab seminar to learn more about Bitcoin and be able to contribute more in the space. But yeah, kind of where we are.
Yeah, same with you, Giacomo. Your kind of view on where we are currently, this kind of crossroads of scaling, and what you'd like to see happen.
So everybody was, including me, was mentioning Alfine in December 2010 about the Bitcoin banks. But actually, the first answer to the total unscalability of the on-chain layer was already given by James A. Donald in November 2008 to Satoshi. It was the first answer. It was like, this is very cool, but cannot possibly scale. And I think that I think I understood it thanks to some Bitcoiner friends like Lawrence and other around 2014. And so I'm not surprised about some people probably after Segwit and Lightning, they were thinking that the new peace achieved with the low fees was forever. But that was just forgetting a fundamental problem with global consensus systems. They cannot scale. Possibly. Also, they also have a terrible privacy. So Lightning is also a way to increase privacy. They have some censorship surface attacks, like in miners paid by the government to mine empty blocks, or even worse, spam-filled blocks, which are the same as empty, but they also weight more on your node. So basically, we have this problem that censorship from miners, it cannot affect directly Lightning transaction, only the opening and closing of channels. So there are so many reasons to move away from global consensus that high fees for me are not something that make me frustrated. Something that just, we knew it was coming for ages. Now it's coming for a spam attack. Okay. This is not sustainable. The spam attack will end like the previous spam attack probable from Bitmain. It will end, but still the direction is high fees, is inevitable on chain. So for me, it's the opposite. I'm not frustrated. I am excited about the business and intellectual opportunities in order to fix second layers to make it more private. What I'm frustrated about is that if you research it a bit, the darknet markets, it's not true that they are all shit coins now. That's not true. If you check, it's not true. They still have mostly Bitcoin in volumes, but none of them are using Lightning yet, which I think it's understandable because receiving privacy is still a little bit bad, but sending privacy is very, very good. So I would love to see more use of Lightning in the criminal industry and then in legal industry, like ransomware. They should be using Lightning. I look forward for that. I'm a little bit frustrated of a low adoption of Lightning among criminals. We can fix that.
All right, John, take us home. Same question.
I would say I didn't realize that Matt was so frustrated with in the BRC thing and all that kind of thing.
Let me be really clear. I'm frustrated with fees being as high as they are. I'm celebrating the fact that fees are high. I'm sad that it's not sustainable.
I'm never going to celebrate high fees, but yeah. $25 is a threshold that gets my attention. You know what I mean? I'm just like, this is a bit much. And if it keeps going up, I can see that it's going to reach a number that will make me unhappy. But I've been trying to stay out of the whole ordinal, all the inscription stuff, the filtering versus censorship and spam. And I'm just staying out of it because I kind of learned my lesson trying to fight a Bitcoin battle when I tried to stop the mempool for RBF thing. It's futile. Whatever happens is going to happen, and your own little mission isn't really going to change much, most likely. But you never know. It's worth a try sometimes. But yeah, so I've been staying out of it. I think it's a tricky area. I think it will solve itself. I don't think the current fees are permanent. Maybe they'll go higher. Maybe they'll stay high longer than we realize. But I just don't think they're permanent, and I don't think we need block size increase right now. Where I'd like to see us go, generally, I would promote a culture of conservatism is where I want to start and say, like, I don't like changing Bitcoin. I don't like proposing soft forks. I think that people should have a lot more skepticism and a lot less cheerleading of new feature proposals. Like, people hear about something like ARC and they just like, they consider themselves tastemakers and they have to decide, is this something that is a trend and do I need to be on this trend? Yes or no? And they kind of put out their heuristic, subconscious filters, and they look at their Twitter feed and they say, oh, this is one of the ones I have to support. Go. And they're like, ARC this, ARC that, ARC is the future, ARC is going to obsolete Lightning. And then you have to deal with this for a few weeks and then it goes away. Please just stop that shit. Like, most of these things are cool. The people that make them are as intelligent as you want to believe that they are, but the actual practicality or usefulness, these are all highly speculative, and these things might just be curiosities, including you heard us even talk about Lightning in this tone, where we're just kind of doing our best to see if we can make this something for retail. But it doesn't mean that we'll succeed. It could just end up peer-to-peer B2B settlement method. So be more realistic about these things and be less cheerleady, and be more open-minded about what might need to be done to on-chain environments. Be more respectful of on-chain as a payment format. What I mean by that is, a lot of people say, oh, but we have Lightning. Just use Lightning. Like, it's going to be fine. Just use Lightning. But that's what Lightning's for, and for payments and things like this. And it's like, okay, but like, if Lightning doesn't work out, like I said, how it might not work out, then what do we do? You can't have all your narratives. Some of the narratives are not compatible. And so you're going to have to be more realistic about which things don't make sense when you say them, because not you guys, but there's some people in the audience that are kind of more superficially involved in Bitcoin. You are making some mistakes. You are attaching yourselves to things that make you look dumb or ignorant or like Ponzi kind of promoters. And I don't think anybody wants to look like a Ponzi promoter or look ignorant, but like, it's true. Like, you just have to like be very realistic, very conservative, and very respectful of that. The real Bitcoin, the core Bitcoin, not Bitcoin Core, the software, but the core of it is on-chain Bitcoin. And if you have expectations of Bitcoin, they should first be possible on-chain for them to have any chance of being possible elsewhere. And so you have to consider these things. And I know Giacomo would probably love to reply to this, but I got to speak last. Sorry, man.
Yeah,
No problem.
You got to see us out. Listen, guys, I mean, awesome to get all three of you together and to go through this. I understand a bit more. I don't understand enough. I didn't even get the chance to go through covenants and what they are. We'll have to do that another time. But look, appreciate you all. Thank you for everything you all do. And good to see you.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for having us.
Speak soon.